The fire that night 5 years ago wasn't supposed to leave survivors. That's what Alpha Caney Stormridge told himself as he stood in his office overlooking the northern Ashpack territory. Watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds where young wolves practiced combat formations, the ritual hunt had been necessary, or so the council had convinced him. Omegas showing signs of independent power were dangerous anomalies, threats to the natural order that had governed werewolf society for centuries. Lyra Ashenmoon had been one of 12 Omegas marked for elimination that night, her crime being that she'd accidentally conjured a small flame during a moment of intense emotion, an ability that should have been impossible for someone of her designation. The council's decree had been absolute, and Caney, newly ascended to his position as Alpha after the mysterious death of his predecessor Magnus, had signed the order without questioning the wisdom of those who'd guided the pack for generations before him. He'd been 23 then, arrogant and certain that his authority was justified by birthright and strength alone. The official report stated that all 12 Omegas had perished in the forest blaze, their bodies consumed so completely by the flames that not even bones remained for proper burial rites. The families had mourned briefly before accepting the pack's compensation and moving forward, as was expected in their rigidly structured society. Caney had filed the incident away in his mind as an unfortunate necessity, one of many difficult decisions an Alpha must make to protect the greater good of the pack. He'd never lost sleep over it, never questioned whether the scared young woman he'd seen being dragged toward the forest had deserved her fate. That was the kind of Alpha he'd been trained to be, one who valued order and tradition above compassion and individual lives. But now, 5 years later, bodies were appearing throughout his wound. Territory marked with silver ash and burns that defied all natural explanation. The first victim had been council member Thaddeus, found in his study with his chest carved open and filled with glowing embers that somehow remained hot for hours after his death without spreading fire to anything around them. The second was Elder Moravin, discovered in the sacred grove with silver flames still dancing across his skin, despite being clinically dead for what the pack doctor estimated was at least 6 hours. The third, fourth, and fifth victims all shared the same council position. All had voted in favor of the Omega Purge 5 years ago, and all died in ways that suggested something far beyond normal werewolf capabilities was hunting them. Caney had tripled security, brought in trackers from allied packs, consulted with every supernatural expert within 500 miles, but nothing explained the silver ash or the flames that burned with cold fire instead of heat. His own wolf, a massive, black beast that had never known fear in combat, grew restless and anxious whenever they approached the crime scenes, whimpering like a pup, confronted with something fundamentally wrong in the natural order. The pack was beginning to whisper about curses and ancient magic, about the old legends of silver wolves that his former tutors had dismissed as fairy tales meant to scare ambitious alphas into treating their omegas with basic decency. Before you continue, if you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more supernatural romance content that explores complex characters and meaningful transformation. Your support helps me create these longer, more developed narratives that go beyond simple romance into examining real issues of power, justice, and redemption. It was during the emergency council meeting, held in the fortified chamber beneath the pack house, where ancient pack laws were carved into stone walls, that Caney first saw her again. The remaining council members had gathered to discuss evacuation protocols and potential alliances with neighboring packs when the heavy oak doors exploded inward, not with physical force but with silver flames that consumed the wood without leaving char marks. Flames that shaped themselves into the form of a wolf before dissipating to reveal a woman standing in the doorway. She was taller than he remembered, her body lean with the kind of strength that came from surviving in the wilderness rather than training in controlled gyms. Her hair had been mousy brown 5 years ago, but now cascaded down her back in waves of silver and white. And her eyes, those eyes that had been soft amber when she'd begged for mercy, now burned with literal silver fire that seemed to pierce through every defense and pretense. Lyra Ashenmoon walked into that council chamber like a queen entering her throne room, not with the submissive posture Omegas were trained to adopt, but with her spine straight and her chin raised in challenge. She wore simple clothes, dark pants, and a fitted shirt that allowed free movement. But there was nothing simple about the power that radiated from her invisible waves, making the air shimmer with heat that somehow didn't burn. The remaining 7 council members scrambled backward, some shifting partially into their wolf forms in instinctive defense. But Caney found himself frozen in place, unable to look away from the woman he'd condemned to death, who now stood before him very much alive and terrifyingly powerful. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the resonance of something far older than her 23 years, as though she'd become a conduit for all the silenced Omegas who'd come before her. She didn't shout or rage, but her words landed with the weight of absolute truth that couldn't be denied or deflected. She told them she knew everything, had spent 5 years gathering evidence and testimony from the families of the murdered Omegas, had documented decades of abuse and systematic oppression that the council had carefully hidden from the wider werewolf community. She told them about the others who'd survived that night, 12 Omegas who'd been marked for death, but who'd somehow endured the flames and emerged changed, awakened to abilities that had been suppressed through generations of selective breeding and cultural conditioning designed to keep Omegas weak and controllable. Lyra explained that the silver fire that killed wasn't her doing alone, but the manifestation of collective Omega rage given form through her as the first silver wolf to fully awaken in 3 centuries. She was the match that lit the flame, but the fuel had been building for generations, fed by every Omega forced into submission, every gift suppressed, every voice silenced. The council members who died hadn't been random targets, but carefully selected symbols of the system that needed to fall, and their deaths were meant as warning shots, not the final judgment. She gave Caney and the surviving council 48 hours to publicly confess their crimes, to open all sealed records regarding Omega suppressions, and to begin implementing structural reforms that would dismantle the hierarchical system that gave Alphas absolute authority over Omega lives. The ultimatum delivered, Lyra turned to leave. But that's when Caney felt it. The sensation that every werewolf both craved and feared. The snap of a mate bond clicking into place with such force that it drove him to his knees. His wolf surged forward, recognizing in Lyra something essential and irreplaceable, seeing past the power and the rage to the woman beneath who was meant to stand beside them, to complete them in ways that had nothing to do with dominance or submission. But even as the bond formed, Caney felt Lyra's rejection of it, a wall of silver fire that slammed into place around her heart, refusing to let the connection fully establish itself despite the biological imperative that drove all wolves to accept their destined mates. She looked back at him with something that might have been pity, or might have been contempt, and told him that destiny meant nothing compared to choice, that she would rather die truly dead than accept a bond with the man who'd signed her death warrant. Then she was gone, dissolving into silver flames that left no trace except the lingering scent of smoke and something indefinably sad, like hope burning to ash. Caney remained on his knees long after the council members fled, feeling the incomplete bond writhing inside him like a living wound, demanding he chase after his mate, while his mind reeled from the implications of everything she'd revealed. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of desperate activity, as Caney did something he'd never done before, and actually investigated the claims Lyra had made, instead of dismissing them as the ravings of a criminal. What he found in the sealed archives, in the hidden records that only the Alpha had access to, broke something fundamental in his worldview. There were detailed logs going back over a century, documenting systematic identification and elimination of Omegas who showed any signs of abilities beyond the accepted norm. There were financial records showing payments made to pack doctors to administer suppressants to pregnant Omegas, ensuring their children would be born weaker and more controllable. There were transcripts of council meetings, where his predecessor Magnus had explicitly discussed breeding programs designed to eliminate certain genetic lines entirely. Worst of all, Caney found records of his own parents' deaths. The car accident that had orphaned him at age 15 and left him to be raised by Magnus and the council, except it hadn't been an accident at all, but a carefully orchestrated murder because his mother, a powerful beta, had discovered the Omega suppression programs and threatened to expose them to the regional Pack Alliance. Magnus had killed Caney's parents and then molded their traumatized son into the perfect puppet Alpha. Someone who'd enforce the oppressive systems without questioning them because he'd been taught from adolescence that strength meant dominance and leadership meant control. Everything Caney believed about himself, about his right to rule, about the natural order of their society, had been built on lies and the graves of innocent people. He'd spent 8 years as Alpha perpetuating the same systems that had murdered his own mother, had signed orders that resulted in Omega deaths, because he'd never bothered to question whether the Council's advice was actually wisdom or just self-serving preservation of their own power. The realization didn't come as a dramatic epiphany, but as a slow, crushing weight that made it hard to breathe, hard to look at himself in the mirror without seeing a monster wearing his face. The 48-hour deadline arrived, and Caney stood before the assembled pack. Every member gathered in the great hall that had hosted generations of pack meetings, and he did something unprecedented. He confessed everything, not hiding behind political language or carefully crafted apologies, but speaking with raw honesty about his complicity in atrocities, about the Omega Purge 5 years ago, about the systematic oppression that had been pack policy for over a century. He presented the evidence he'd found, projected the documents onto screens so everyone could see the truth in black and white, and he accepted full responsibility for every Omega who died under his leadership, even those killed by policies he'd inherited, but failed to question. The pack's reaction was explosive and divided. Some called for his immediate execution, demanding that he face the same fate as the Omegas he'd condemned. Others defended him, arguing that he'd been manipulated and that exposing the truth took more courage than maintaining comfortable lies. Omega Pack members, the majority of whom had lived their entire lives accepting their lower status as natural and unchangeable, struggled to process the revelation that their oppression had been deliberately engineered rather than biologically inevitable. The betas who'd enforced the hierarchical systems found themselves confronting their own complicity, their own failure to question orders that had seemed reasonable at the time, but now appeared monstrous in retrospect. Throughout the chaos, Caney felt the incomplete mate bond pulling at him, making him hyper-aware of Lyra's presence, even though he couldn't see her in the crowd. His wolf wanted to find her, to prostrate themselves before her and beg for forgiveness, to offer everything they had as penance for what they'd done. But Caney knew that grand gestures meant nothing, that Lyra had no reason to trust his sudden transformation from tyrant to reformer, that if he wanted any chance at redemption, it would have to come through sustained action. Over time, not dramatic declarations. He announced his resignation from the Alpha position, effective immediately, stating that he would submit himself to whatever justice system the pack chose to establish once the hierarchical structure was dismantled. He established a victims fund using his personal wealth, ensuring that every Omega family affected by the purges would receive compensation, not as payment for lives lost, but as acknowledgement that debts existed that could never be fully repaid. He opened the pack house to any Omega who needed sanctuary, transforming his own private quarters into safe rooms with medical care and counseling services. These weren't gestures meant to win Lyra's favor, but actions he should have taken years ago, actions that were right regardless of whether anyone ever forgave him. Comment below about what you think Caney should do next, whether redemption is even possible for someone who's caused so much harm, or if some actions are truly unforgivable. I love reading your perspectives on these complex moral questions. Lyra watched these developments from the shadows, neither revealing herself fully nor disappearing entirely, maintaining presence just strong enough that Caney always knew she was observing, evaluating, waiting to see if his transformation would last beyond the initial shame and crisis. She'd seen too many powerful men perform temporary contrition, only to return to their old patterns once the immediate pressure faded. She'd learned, through bitter experience, that words were cheap, and even actions could be performative if they weren't backed by genuine internal change that persisted when no one was watching. While Caney dismantled the power structures in the Northern Ash Pack, Lyra focused on the other survivors from that night 5 years ago. The Omegas who'd been scattered across multiple territories, hiding their awakened abilities and living in constant fear of discovery. She found them one by one, using the silver fire that connected all of them like a network of living flame. And she brought them together in a sanctuary she'd established in unclaimed wilderness between pack territories. There were 11 others besides herself, each with unique manifestations of the ancient Omega power that had been suppressed for so long. There was Mira, who could heal any wound by singing old songs in a language none of them consciously knew, but all understood instinctively. There was Thomas, a male Omega whose touch could make plants grow instantly, covering entire clearings in protective thorns within seconds. There was elderly Vera, who'd been 50 when the purge happened, and who could see threads of fate connecting people, showing the consequences of choices before they were made. Each of them had survived the flames and emerged changed, and each carried trauma from the attempt on their lives that would take years to fully process. Lyra became their leader not through dominance but through her willingness to be vulnerable, to share her own struggles and doubts, to admit when she didn't have answers. She taught them to use their abilities not as weapons, but as tools for building the kind of world they wanted to live in, one where power meant capacity to protect and nurture, rather than capacity to control and destroy. She helped them process their rage and grief without letting those emotions consume them entirely, acknowledging that anger at injustice was valid and necessary, but that they couldn't let it define them completely, or they'd become the same kind of tyrants they were fighting against. It was during one of these training sessions that Alpha Seraphina Moonwhisper arrived at their sanctuary, leading a delegation from the Western Starlight Pack and offering alliance and resources. Seraphina was everything the old guard alphas feared. A woman who'd claimed her position through merit rather than birthright, who'd built her pack on principles of equality and shared governance, and who'd been vocal critic of traditional hierarchical systems for years. She offered Lyra military support, political backing, and safe territory for all the awakened Omegas if they would join forces to pressure the regional pack alliance into mandating reforms across all territories. The offer was tempting, and Lyra's first instinct was to accept immediately, to use Seraphina's resources to accelerate the changes she was fighting for. But Vera, with her ability to see fate's threads, warned that Seraphina's motivations weren't as pure as they appeared, that accepting her help would create obligations that would limit their freedom in ways they couldn't yet anticipate. Lyra trusted Vera's gift, but also understood that sometimes you had to work with imperfect allies to achieve necessary goals, that waiting for perfect circumstances often meant never acting at all. She negotiated with Seraphina carefully, accepting material support and political advocacy, but refusing to formally join the Western Starlight Pack, or to commit the awakened Omegas to any military action beyond self-defense. She established clear boundaries around their autonomy, making it explicit that alliance didn't mean subordination, and that the sanctuary would remain independent territory regardless of who provided resources to sustain it. Seraphina accepted these terms with grace that seemed genuine, but Lyra noticed how the other Alpha's eyes tracked the displays of Omega power during training sessions, calculating and assessing in ways that suggested she saw the awakened Omegas as assets to be acquired rather than people to be respected. Back in Northern Ash territory, Kaney's reforms were meeting resistance from predictable quarters. The remaining council members who hadn't been killed by the Silver Fire opposed every change, arguing that dismantling traditional hierarchies would lead to chaos and weakness that rival packs would exploit. Beta enforcers who'd built their entire identities around maintaining order through force struggled to adapt to new protocols that emphasized de-escalation and community accountability over punishment and control. Even some Omegas resisted the changes, finding the prospect of equality more frightening than the familiar oppression, because at least they'd understood the rules of the old system. Kaney found himself navigating political complexities he'd never had to consider, when he could simply decree what would happen and expect immediate obedience. He learned to listen to perspectives that contradicted his own, to sit with discomfort instead of shutting down dissent, to acknowledge when he didn't know the right answer instead of pretending alpha authority made him infallible. He established councils with equal representation from all designations, created accountability systems where even the alpha could be overruled by majority vote, and implemented transparent record-keeping, so that every decision and its justification was available for pack members to review. The transformation wasn't smooth or linear. Caney made mistakes, sometimes reverting to authoritarian impulses when stressed or defaulting to control when collaboration felt too slow. But he'd surrounded himself with advisors who were willing to call him out, including several Omegas who'd survived his previous policies and who had no patience for backsliding or excuses. They kept him honest, not through deference, but through relentless accountability, refusing to let him hide behind good intentions when his actions fell short of his stated values. 6 months into the reforms, a crisis emerged that tested everything Caney had been working toward. A group of young alphas from the pack, emboldened by rhetoric from traditionalist council members, attempted a coup, arguing that Caney's weakness was destroying pack security, and that they needed to return to strong leadership before rivals attacked. The coup was poorly planned and easily defeated, but it forced Caney to make a choice about how to respond. The old Caney would have executed the traitors publicly as warning to anyone else considering rebellion. The new systems he'd established called for restorative justice and rehabilitation, rather than punishment for punishment's sake. Caney chose the harder path, not because it was politically advantageous, but because it aligned with the values he was trying to build. He offered the coup participants a choice between exile or remaining in the pack under supervised reform programs, where they'd work directly with Omega families to understand the harm traditional hierarchies had caused. Most chose exile, preferring to maintain their worldview intact rather than confront uncomfortable truths. But 3 of the young alphas chose to stay, and Caney invested personal time in mentoring them, sharing his own journey from arrogance to accountability, being vulnerable about his ongoing struggles and doubts. It was this choice, this willingness to extend to others the grace he'd been given despite not deserving it, that finally made Lyra pause and reconsider her absolute rejection of the mate bond. She'd been watching from a distance, always aware of Caney through the incomplete connection between them. And she'd seen him make this decision without knowing she was observing, without performing for her approval. She'd seen him choose the difficult, uncertain path of genuine transformation over the easy comfort of familiar. Cruelty, and something in her heart that had been locked tight behind walls of silver fire, began, very slowly, to thaw. She didn't go to him immediately, because trust wasn't built through single moments of goodness, but through patterns of behavior sustained over time. She continued her work with the awakened Omegas, continued building the sanctuary into a thriving community where people with abilities that had once been cause for execution could live openly and safely. She continued gathering evidence of oppressive practices in other packs, building a comprehensive case for systemic reform that went far beyond Northern Ash territory. But she also began to let herself imagine, just in possibilities, what it might mean to accept the bond, to stand beside Caney not as victim forgiving oppressor, but as equal partner in rebuilding a world that had failed them both in different ways. The Regional Pack Alliance Summit happened 10 months after Lyra's initial ultimatum, bringing together alphas, betas, and for the first time in recorded history, Omega representatives from over 30 territories. Caney had been instrumental in organizing the summit, using his position and the publicity around Northern Ash's transformation to pressure other packs into participating. Serafina brought significant political weight to the effort, and together they'd created enough momentum that refusing to attend would have been political suicide for any alpha who wanted to maintain regional standing. Lyra attended as the acknowledged leader of the awakened Omegas, walking into that summit hall wearing simple clothes that contrasted sharply with the formal regalia of the alphas, but commanding attention through sheer presence and undeniable power. She presented evidence that took 6 hours to fully detail, documenting centuries of systematic oppression, showing genetic records that proved Omega suppression had been deliberate policy, presenting testimony from hundreds of Omegas, across multiple territories who'd lived under constant threat and degradation. She spoke with controlled passion, never raising her voice but letting the facts speak for themselves, building an irrefutable case that the entire werewolf social structure was built on foundation of lies and violence. The response was predictably divided. Progressive alphas like Serafina called for immediate reforms and reparations. Traditionalists tried to discredit the evidence or argue that omega suppression had been necessary for species survival. Moderates sought compromise positions that would allow symbolic changes without fundamentally altering power dynamics. The debate raged for 3 days, sometimes heated enough that fights nearly broke out, always returning to the central question of whether werewolf society would choose justice or comfort, transformation or stagnation. If you're invested in seeing how this story resolves, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the conclusion. These longer narratives take significant time to develop properly, and your support through subscriptions, likes, and comments helps me continue creating content that treats complex themes with the depth they deserve. It was Caney who broke the deadlock, not through political maneuvering, but through public testimony that stripped away every defense and pretense. He stood before the assembly and detailed his own crimes, not in abstract terms, but with specific names of Omegas who died because of orders he'd signed, with faces of families he'd destroyed, with full acknowledgement that his recent reforms didn't erase the harm he'd caused or entitle him to forgiveness from anyone. He testified against himself, providing evidence that could be used to bring formal charges, accepting that justice might require his own execution or permanent exile. But more importantly, Caney testified about what he'd learned through the process of genuine accountability, about how the hierarchical systems didn't actually make packs stronger, but made them brittle and vulnerable by wasting the talents and perspectives of the majority of their members. He presented data from Northern Ash, showing that pack cohesion and security had improved dramatically since implementing egalitarian reforms, that Omega participation in governance had led to better policies and more sustainable resource management, that treating all designations as equals created loyalty based on mutual respect rather than fear-based compliance that evaporated the moment enforcement weakened. He challenged the other alphas directly, asking them whether they truly believed they were strong enough to deserve their positions, or whether they were terrified of fair competition, whether they actually cared about their pack's well-being or just their own power, whether they wanted to build something lasting or preside over systems that would inevitably collapse under the weight of their own injustice. He didn't speak as one alpha to others, but as someone who'd walked through fire and emerged on the other side with clarity about what actually mattered. And his words carried weight, precisely because everyone knew he had nothing left to lose. No political capital to protect, no reputation to preserve. The final vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. 23 packs voted to implement mandatory reforms, including Omega representation in all governance bodies, abolition of designation-based legal restrictions, establishment of independent accountability systems, and creation of reparations funds for victims of historical oppression. 7 packs voted against the reforms, and were given the option to leave the regional alliance, which 3 of them took, choosing isolation over equality. The remaining 4 packs that had voted no agreed to comply with the new standards under protest, maintaining their objections but accepting the alliance's authority. In the aftermath of the summit, as delegates dispersed and the real work of implementing reforms began, Lyra finally approached Caney directly for the first time since that initial confrontation in the council chamber. She found him alone in the gardens outside the summit hall, sitting on a bench and looking exhausted in ways that went beyond physical tiredness. She sat beside him without asking permission, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, just existing in proximity, while the incomplete mate bond hummed between them with painful intensity. When Lyra finally broke the silence, she didn't speak of forgiveness or acceptance, but of something more complex and honest. She told him that she'd watched his transformation over the past months, had seen him choose accountability even when it cost him everything, had witnessed him extend to others the grace he'd been denied. She told him she still carried rage for what he'd done, that forgiveness wasn't something she could offer because the harm had been too great and affected too many people beyond just herself. But she also told him that she recognized genuine change when she saw it, that she believed his transformation was real, rather than performative, and that she was willing to explore what the mate bond might mean if approached as partnership between equals, rather than hierarchy between Alpha and Omega. Caney's response was quiet and stripped of the arrogance that had once defined him. He told her he understood he had no right to expect anything from her, that he would spend the rest of his life working to repair the damage his actions had caused, regardless of whether she ever accepted the bond. He told her that loving her meant respecting her autonomy absolutely, which included her right to reject him entirely if that was what she needed for her own healing and happiness. He told her he'd learned that real strength came from lifting others up rather than dominating them, from admitting mistakes rather than defending them, from choosing the hard right over the easy wrong, even when no one was watching to praise the choice. They didn't kiss that day or make dramatic declarations of love. Instead, they sat together as the sun set, talking honestly about trauma and healing, about justice and mercy, about the difference between destiny and choice. They acknowledged the bond between them but agreed it would develop slowly, with clear boundaries and constant communication, with understanding that Lyra's acceptance was never guaranteed and would have to be earned through consistent action over years, not months. They became partners in the work of transformation, not just of Northern Ashpac, but of the broader werewolf society, understanding that their relationship would be forever intertwined with that larger mission. The next 2 years were marked by intense work and slow, careful relationship building. Caney continued his reforms in Northern Ash, now with Lyra's input and occasional direct intervention when he fell into old patterns or made decisions that prioritized efficiency over equity. Lyra expanded the Omega Sanctuary into a formal educational institution, teaching awakened Omegas to develop their abilities, while also offering programs for any pack member who wanted to learn new approaches to leadership and community building. They worked together on the regional implementation of summit reforms, traveling to different packs to offer support and address resistance, becoming symbols of what transformation could look like when people committed to it fully. Their romantic relationship developed in quiet moments between the public work, in late-night conversations about philosophy and ethics, in shared grief over what had been lost and couldn't be recovered, in growing trust that came from seeing each other at worst and choosing to stay anyway. Lyra learned that Caney's arrogance had hidden deep insecurity, that his cruelty had been learned. Behavior from a man who'd murdered his parents and shaped him into a weapon, that underneath the alpha exterior was someone capable of profound gentleness and surprising vulnerability. Caney learned that Lyra's strength came not from the silver fire, but from her capacity for hope despite every reason to despair, from her ability to imagine better futures and then work tirelessly to build them, from her refusal to let trauma define her completely, even while acknowledging its impact. They fought, sometimes, disagreeing sharply about strategy and ethics, about when to push for radical change versus when to accept incremental progress. But they'd learned to fight productively, to argue about ideas without attacking each other, to apologize genuinely when they caused harm, to repair ruptures quickly rather than letting resentment build. They learned each other's triggers and tender spots, learned how to support without smothering, how to challenge without diminishing, how to be individuals, while also being partners. The mate bond fully settled into place not during a dramatic moment, but on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when they were reviewing budget documents for the Omega Education Center. And Lyra made a joke about Caney's terrible handwriting, and he laughed, really laughed in a way that lit up his whole face. And she realized with sudden clarity that she'd fallen in love with him not despite his past, but because of how he'd confronted it. Not because he was perfect, but because he was genuinely trying every day to be better. The bond clicked into completion so smoothly that neither of them noticed at first, too absorbed in their work and each other. And it was only later that night, when Lyra felt the full depth of Caney's emotions through their connection, that she understood what had happened. They formally partnered 3 years after the summit, in a ceremony that bore no resemblance to traditional Alpha-Omega matings, with their implications of ownership and submission. They stood as equals before the assembled pack, not making vows of obedience, but promises of mutual respect, not claiming each other as possessions, but choosing each other as partners in building the world they wanted to see. The ceremony was officiated by Vera, who could see the threads of fate weaving them together in patterns that suggested their bond would ripple out through generations. affecting the broader werewolf world in ways neither of them could fully anticipate. Serafina attended the ceremony, and in private conversation afterward, she revealed what Vera had warned about years before. She admitted that her initial interest in Alliance had been motivated partly by desire to acquire the awakened Omegas as assets, that she'd seen them as potential military advantage against rival packs. But she also told them that working alongside Lyra and Caney had changed her own understanding of what leadership should look like, that she'd learned from their example, about the difference between collecting power and sharing it. She apologized for her initial opportunism and asked whether they could build a new alliance based on genuinely shared values rather than strategic convenience. The conversation that followed was difficult, but ultimately productive, establishing new terms for inter-pack cooperation that emphasized mutual growth over competitive advantage, that valued honesty about motivations over politically expedient alliances. It was emblematic of the broader changes happening across werewolf society, where old patterns of competition and dominance were slowly, painfully giving way to new models of collaboration and shared prosperity. The epilogue to this story comes a decade after Lyra walked into that council chamber, wreathed in silver fire. The Northern Ash Pack has become a model that other territories study and emulate, not perfect by any measure, but demonstrably more just and sustainable than the hierarchical systems it replaced. The Omega Education Center has expanded into a full university with students from dozens of packs, teaching not just ability development, but also history, ethics, and governance theory. The Regional Pack Alliance has grown to include over 50 territories, all committed to egalitarian principles, even if implementation remains imperfect and ongoing. Lyra and Caney have 3 children, none of whom will ever know a world where their worth is determined by designation rather than character. They're raising them to understand power as responsibility rather than privilege, to see authority as something granted by community consent rather than claimed through force, to believe that their parents' past mistakes are lessons about why constant vigilance against injustice matters. Their eldest daughter shows signs of inheriting Lyra's silver fire. Their middle son has Caney's strategic mind. Their youngest child gender non-conforming in ways that would have been dangerous in the old world, but is celebrated in the new one they've helped build. Caney still carries guilt for the Omegas who died before he changed, visits their families regularly, contributes to memorial funds, ensures their stories are taught as cautionary tales about the cost of unchecked power. He's learned that redemption isn't a destination but a direction, that he'll never fully atone for his past, but that doesn't absolve him from trying every day to do better. He leads the Northern Ash Pack alongside Lyra, not as alpha in the traditional sense, but as co-administrator in a distributed governance system, where major decisions require broad consensus. Lyra has found peace, not through forgetting or minimizing what happened, but through building a future that honors those who didn't survive by ensuring their deaths weren't meaningless. She teaches young Omegas to develop their abilities without shame, helps them understand that power without compassion becomes tyranny, regardless of whether it's wielded by alphas or formerly oppressed Omegas who've gained strength. She writes extensively about social transformation, her work studied in universities across the werewolf world and beyond, offering frameworks for how oppressed groups can fight for liberation without reproducing the same patterns of domination they're resisting. The silver fire still burns within her, will burn for the rest of her life. But it's no longer the cold flame of rage and grief. It's transformed into something warmer, something that can destroy injustice when necessary, but prefers to illuminate paths forward, to warm those who are cold and lost, to light the way toward the better world that each generation must choose to build anew. She and Caney stand together not as symbols of personal redemption, but as proof that systems can change when people commit to transformation fully, when they're willing to sacrifice comfort and privilege for justice, when they understand that love means action sustained over time, rather than feelings that fade when challenges arise. Their story isn't a fairy tale with neat resolution, but an ongoing journey with setbacks and victories, with days when the work feels impossible, and days when progress seems real and lasting. It's a story about choosing each other and choosing justice, about recognizing that those choices aren't separate but deeply intertwined. about building a love that doesn't exist in isolation from the world, but actively works to make the world better for everyone, not just for themselves. And on quiet nights when the children are asleep and the pack is peaceful, Lyra and Caney sit together and remember the Omega girl who died in flames 5 years ago, and the Alpha who signed her death warrant, and they honor those versions of themselves by being nothing like them anymore, by choosing every day to be the people that girl deserved to meet, the people that boy could have become if anyone had shown him there was another way to be strong. They choose each other and they choose justice, and in that choosing, they light fires that will burn long after they're gone. Silver flames that illuminate the path for all who come after,